Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Bhakti Fundamentals. Thank you all for listening to our talks and continuing to inquire into Bhakti Yoga. Today, we return to our mini-series about the Absolute Truth with our second installment. The subject this time revolves around Paramatma realization of God, which is a partial perspective on the Absolute Truth. But first, to review some. Recall that last week we discussed about how Krishna has three aspects or features, three ways of relating to him according to how we wish to relate to him. And he describes them in the Bhagavad Gita. They are his impersonal Brahman feature, his localized Paramatma feature, and his personal feature, the Bhagavan feature, as Krishna, the Supreme Person. Last week we discussed the preliminary understanding of the Supreme as the impersonal substratum of all existence, as Brahman. Remember that there's a whole class of spiritual seekers, the impersonalists, who believe that God is ultimately just Brahman, just an impersonal force behind all of existence. However, we come to learn in the Gita that the understanding of God as Brahman is really just the most basic understanding of God. It is incomplete. Why? Well, as we discussed last week, persons can act impersonally. However, personality cannot derive from impersonality. Thus, Krishna, or God, must have personality. And in fact, he not only has personality, he is the very source of personality. He is the Supreme Person. But he also has an impersonal feature, Brahman, which was the subject of our discussion last time. Now this week we move on to Krishna's localized Paramatma feature. Note that the understanding of God as Paramatma is still only a partial perspective on the Supreme. We'll see why as we discuss. But learning about Paramatma helps us to understand the Supreme more and is actually very useful for us in our personal practice of Bhakti Yoga. We'll talk about this also more in a bit. But as we delve into today's topic, one important point to keep in mind is that there is only one God who has three features: his impersonal feature, his localized one, and his personal one. One God, three features. So next, remember the impersonalism to personalism spectrum that we introduced last week. The reason we present it again is that it helps us to remember that what we learned today isn't the whole picture just yet. In reality, the Bhagavan aspect, which is Krishna, the Supreme Person, is the source of both the Paramatma and Brahman aspects of the Supreme. In other words, from the Supreme Person, Krishna, comes everything else in existence, including his impersonal feature. Okay, on to Paramatma now. What we will find is that the Paramatma aspect of the Supreme is more variegated than Krishna's impersonal Brahman aspect. The word Paramatma literally means supersoul. Param, super, Atma, soul. We are little souls, if you will, and Paramatma is the localized aspect of the Supreme who resides in the heart of every living entity, and also within and between every atom in the material universes. Paramatma is essentially Krishna's all-pervasive feature. He is Krishna who resides in the heart of every living entity. Whereas impersonal Brahman is the understanding of God as the impersonal background of all existence, Paramatma is the understanding of God as the one who pervades, regulates, and oversees the material universes and all life within those universes. And because Paramatma resides in the heart of every living entity, he is aware of everything, including everyone's desires and thoughts, etc. Therefore, when someone on their spiritual path realizes the Paramatma aspect of Krishna, they have really realized two features of the Supreme. His feature of being eternal, which is also realized by those with Brahman realization, and his feature of being all knowledgeable. Now, how is this information about Paramatma practical for us? Does it change anything for us in our daily lives? If so, how? What we've learned so far seems very philosophical. Well, here's why learning about Paramatma is important. Seated in our hearts, Paramatma knows our deepest desires. Paramatma is Krishna, who accompanies us at all times. We are never actually alone. As Paramatma, Krishna is our closest friend and ever well-wisher, hoping that we'll turn to him and desire spiritual life. But whatever we desire, whether it's material or spiritual, Paramatma is privy to it, and he grants us that which we desire most. In other words, we propose and Paramatma disposes. What does this mean? It means that when we desire something, it is Paramatma, God within our hearts, who sanctions it. But Krishna never forces us to desire a certain way. He wants everything to be in our best interest, which would be for us to take up spiritual life, but he won't force us to do so. He honors our free will. He honors what we wish to do. Of course, this means if we act materially or badly, we can't blame Krishna either. We have free will. Krishna says in the Gita, in chapter 4, verse 11, "As they take shelter of me, I reward them accordingly." As we take shelter of Krishna by listening to his instructions in the Gita and trying to link to him through the practices of Bhakti Yoga, he reciprocates with us. This brings up a point about spiritual versus material desires. If we desire spiritual life and a relationship with Krishna, with God, then Krishna will set things up for us in an amazing way. Most of the time, at least before taking up Bhakti Yoga, our material desires are foremost, and so Paramatma reciprocates with those and gives us material life. Of course, material desires translate into ultimately returning to the material world, accepting another material body, and going through the cycle of birth and death again and again and again. Because that's what we want when we have material desires, influenced as we are by the modes of material nature. And that's a whole other topic, a whole other class. Thus, it's very beneficial for us to learn to control our minds and to desire spiritual life. If we do so, Krishna will help us to approach him. This is the real reason, the power of learning about Paramatma in our hearts, about God in our hearts. Once we know that God resides in our hearts as Paramatma and is listening to our deepest desires and granting them, then we can refine our desires such that we're benefited spiritually. And of course, Krishna will take care of us if we take shelter of him. He'll reciprocate with us according to our level of surrender to him. So our material lives are also benefited when we take shelter of him via the practices of Bhakti Yoga. Now, of course, Krishna's reciprocation with our desires also occurs according to our qualification and karma also. As an example, as a high schooler, we may wish to attend Harvard University, and yet we still need the qualifications to get into that school. And another point is that our desires may not be granted on our timetable. Krishna has the zoom out perspective on our lives, and his timetable is the one that is the most advantageous for us. Of course, one of the takeaways from this discussion on Paramatma is that the best desires to have are spiritual desires, and the best actions we can take are spiritual actions. There are many verses in the Gita that speak to this important point. One such verse is chapter 10, verse 10, in which Krishna states, "To those who are always engaged in serving me with great love and devotion, I give the understanding by which they can come to me." Krishna knows if we wish to approach him, and he himself then provides the understanding, the intelligence by which we can approach him. And as we engage in Bhakti Yoga and serve him, he reciprocates by providing us with deeper spiritual realizations that propel us forward even more. The Vedic literature gives the analogy that the supersoul, or Paramatma, and the individual soul are like two birds sitting in the same tree. The individual soul, us, is going about life, acting and desiring various things, while the supersoul stands by and watches, waiting for his companion, us, to turn away from material life and turn inward toward him. And again, this is the great benefit of knowing about Krishna as Paramatma in the heart, knowing that he witnesses our innermost desires and grants them. We are never undertaking spiritual life alone. If we really want it, Paramatma arranges things for us so that we can gain the resources and knowledge to approach, know, and serve him. If we take one step toward him, he takes 10 or more toward us. On the note of arranging things for us according to our desire and level of surrender to him, Paramatma is actually the source of our knowledge and remembrance of all things. In the Gita, chapter 15, verse 15, Krishna confirms this fact. He says, "I am situated within the heart of everyone, and from me come all remembrance, knowledge, and forgetfulness." Since Paramatma resides in our hearts, he is the source of our epiphanies, intuitions, instinct, and flashes of inspiration. He's also the source of that gut feeling we have sometimes when we're about to do something, like take a shortcut down a dark alley, but just have a bad feeling about it. So Paramatma warns us also. Actually, Krishna as Paramatma in our heart is always speaking to us, but in our impure condition we cannot hear him. Now, the implications of this verse are interesting to explore. For instance, without Paramatma, we wouldn't even know how to get out of bed in the morning. Every night we fall asleep, and while our physical bodies stay in bed, the subtle body, the mind, is active. However, when we wake up from sleep, we again remember what we were doing the day before and what we have to do on the current day. That remembrance comes from Paramatma, comes from God in the heart. Thus, Paramatma remembers everything. And his remembrance is all-encompassing. For instance, while we typically forget everything from our past lifetimes when we change bodies at the end of them, Supersoul, or Paramatma, retains this knowledge for us. That is why he is known as Supersoul. And so, in spite of the fact that we forget our past lives, in our current bodies, we begin acting and working according to our past deeds. And the knowledge of how to do so is provided by Paramatma. Now, while this can translate into a lot of material desires carrying over into this life, what's nice is that all of the spiritual progress we made in our past lives remains with us also. And Paramatma then prompts us to remember in this lifetime where we left off in spiritual life in the last lifetime. In other words, in this lifetime, we'll find ourselves in a situation conducive to picking up where we left off spiritually in our last life. There is no loss in spiritual life. Now, as we approach the end of our discussion on Paramatma, let's try to see where we are in the scope of understanding the three aspects of the Absolute Truth, or God, namely Brahman, Paramatma, and Bhagavan. Remember that we still have part 3, covering the Bhagavan understanding of the Supreme, coming up. How does that understanding fit into today's talk? Well, say we're studying outside at a picnic table, and out of the corner of our eye we see what we think is a person moving near us. We turn quickly and see the back of a person just now disappearing behind a building. But what we saw was enough to confirm that it was indeed a person. This is akin to Paramatma realization. Brahman realization is like the early dawn of spiritual life, when the sun is just beginning to rise, but things are still mostly shrouded by the darkness of night. Paramatma realization is akin to seeing that, upon even more illumination, after dawn, all forms of life are animated and moving about by the presence of the individual soul, us, the individual jivas, as well as the super soul within us, as well as God within us. There is more knowledge at this stage of realization, at the Paramatma level of realization of the Supreme. Yet, as we have been noting all along in our exploration of the Absolute Truth, Paramatma is still an incomplete perspective on the Supreme. To go back to our analogy, we have so far confirmed that the form we saw out of the corner of our eye was a human one. But what about the person's features, their face and expression, their smile, their name, who they are? That leads us to the even more complete and perfect realization of the Supreme as Bhagavan, as the Supreme Person. So stay tuned. Thank you for listening to our discussion today, and we look forward to offering part 3 of our mini-series on the Absolute Truth next week on Bhakti Fundamentals. In the meantime, if you have questions, just reach out and we'll address them in our future talks. Thank you so much.